Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am really pleased to have with me Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Thanks for joining me, Daniel.
Thanks for having me back, Jay.
It's really good to talk to you again after missing you for a week or so here. We would like to start out, I know not the Ukrainian thing seems to have sort of settled down a little bit, but could you maybe give our listeners a little bit of an update on where that situation stands right now? There's some talk about maybe some peaceful solution or some mediation by the Germans and the French, perhaps?
Yeah, it looks like this might be another round of some talks that took place, I guess, about a month or so ago, which at the time was interesting and remains to be interesting that the U.S. is not involved, which probably means there's a better chance for some peace to come of it. But apparently in Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus, there'll be a meeting between President Putin, Ukrainian President Poroshenko, and some European leaders, I believe, as well, will be there, and to try to discuss some solution to Ukraine, which, as your listeners know, or hopefully they know, they wouldn't know if they listen to the mainstream media, but has become an absolute bloody disaster, with thousands of civilians being killed, with the forces from Kiev just simply firing shells into densely populated civilian areas. And I'll spare your listeners the details, but unfortunately, because I want to see for myself, you can see these horrific pictures of people carrying their shopping bags as they're going to the market, and they're just laying in the street blown up. Just dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And the U.S. Pretends that it doesn't exist. The U.S. media doesn't report it at all. When they do report it, they report it as if somehow the separatists are killing their own people in eastern Ukraine,
Right.
Just like they said about Gaza, that no, this wasn't Israeli fire that was killing the Gazans, the Palestinians in Gaza. It was Hamas killing their own people. This is what they always do when inconvenient truths are they're confronted with inconvenient truths, and this is happening in Ukraine, and no one's talking about it. So it's an absolute tragic situation. People in Lugansk have not had food or water or any electricity for at least 2 or 3 weeks now. And as your listeners may have heard, the Russians dispensed a column of, I think, some 180 humanitarian trucks, so full of the basics for living, water and a little bit of food and clothing. And, of course, the Ukrainian government in Kiev claimed that this was a Trojan horse, that they were sending in weapons. This is the big Russian invasion. And the Russians simply allowed the Red Cross and journalists who were there to look in the trucks, and it's been certified that this is humanitarian goods. So once again, the government in Kiev was lying, just like they lied over the weekend when they said that they had fired on and destroyed a column of Russian APVs that had traveled into Ukraine, and that absolutely wasn't true. So that, I guess, in a nutshell, is what happened. There is actually quite a bit happening, but not much of it is good news.
So it seems, though, the Red Cross should be trustworthy to Americans, but apparently it's not, huh?
Well, the U.S. has continuously believed what the Kiev government has said. This goes from the Malaysian air flight to the fact that the claims that they shot up a bunch of Russian military vehicles inside Ukraine, but then couldn't produce a single photograph to back it up. The U.S. basically keeps repeating the lies of the government in Kiev, and so they look foolish, but I guess they simply seem to ignore when they're caught in these lies.
Well, from the Ukraine to Iraq, northern Iraq, what's the latest there, Daniel? What's going on there now with supposedly the United States was going in with military force, with bombings to get rid of the bad guys and protect all those Christians that our government cares so much about on the mountain in Iraq and the Kurds, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. But that wasn't even the mission as it was stated. And actually, they're not Christians. They're a small subsect that's related to. It's sort of a semi-Muslim group. There are Christians in the areas, but the group that the U.S. is purportedly saving are not Christians.
Huh.
But the Obama initially announced that he was going to conduct some airstrikes to rescue this people. 100,000 of them in the area were at risk from ISIS troops. These are the radical Islamists. And also to protect U.S. personnel who were in a consulate up in the Kurdistan area. Well, this very, very quickly, the mission, as it always does, very, very quickly crept, as it does. And now I think I read today that over 2/3 of the bombing runs have not at all been related to either of these two stated goals. They've been to dislodge ISIS from a dam that they've occupied near Mosul and a few other things. So the whole pretext for the war was to save this minority group, of which there were 100,000 facing peril in the region. Well, last week the Defense Department came out and said, well, actually, now that they looked into it, there's only about 2,000 people there, and a lot of them don't want to be rescued because they've always lived there.
Huh.
So I think we talked about this maybe last week, Jay, about how, unfortunately, a lot of even libertarians were suckered into this by the propaganda that we've got to save these people. You know, we created this mess, and now we've got to solve it, without even thinking that bombs will not solve the problems created by bombs. Intervention can't solve the problems created by intervention. So just on top of that, you see that the whole thing was a pretext and a lie anyway, and the U.S. mission is very, very different from that. The U.S. mission consists of regime change in Iraq, which it has successfully completed. It's to reassert U.S. troops. Everyone likes to attack Obama for pulling out the troops in 2011, but what people don't want to admit is that the troops were taken out in 2011 because Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister of Iraq, refused to continue to grant them the immunity and amnesty to remain in his country. He didn't sign the Status of Forces agreement. So it wasn't that Obama had simply abandoned Iraq. It was that the Iraqis didn't want to be occupied any longer.
Well, he was our puppet. The fellow that we just discharged over there, Maliki, was our puppet. I guess since he didn't cooperate with us, we need a new puppet now?
That's exactly what it is, and that's been the case for regime change throughout the decades. As a matter of fact, in Iraq itself, Saddam Hussein was not long ago our puppet, so to speak, not so directly as Maliki, but he certainly was doing a lot of the U.S. bidding several decades ago until the U.S. decided to turn on him and have regime change there. But that's also the case with Gaddafi, who had cooperated with the U.S. And then became on the outs. Also, you can go back to Noriega in Panama and so many others. It's always dangerous to be an ally of the Americans.
I wonder, I guess these fellows, these puppets, at some point in time sort of think like John Kennedy might have thought that he was the president of the United States. They must think that they have some right to sovereignty, and they maybe go against the United States what we want, and then they have to be done away with in one way or another, perhaps because of local interests that are varied with the United States interest, or with the interest of the people that control the United States foreign policy, I should say.
Yeah, well, it gets to be a delicate balancing act. Certainly, I mean, who would want to run Iraq? It's almost an impossible country to run anyway. Things are no doubt far worse than they were under Saddam Hussein, but I think Maliki had to balance the desires of the people he was governing, which were to get rid of the U.S. occupation, which was obviously was never popular despite what the neocons promised us. So he had those kind of demands on him, but he also had the U.S. making its own demands. And so he was put in a very difficult situation. So now the U.S., I guess, thinks that their next puppet will be more obedient. And they seem to be getting their way because they're breaking away Kurdistan from Iraq. That's the one thing that the U.S. is doing. Kurdistan is very oil-rich, and there are a lot of very well-connected people, including in the United States, who are heavily invested in the potential for oil in that region. That says a lot. That says a lot about that.
So if we can get the northern part of Iraq separated from the southern part and then take control of that, we can grab more of the goodies for the United States oil interests, I guess.
Yeah, for well-connected people, exactly. And
Well-connected people, nothing to do with a free market. It has to do with fascist economics, essentially.
exactly, and trust me, the people who everyone is crying about now, who are being oppressed, and certainly it is a serious situation. They'll be dropped like hot potatoes once they break this away. You won't hear another word about these religious minorities there, because there's no. I mean, things are probably bad under the current rule of the Baghdad regime, but things will be no better under Kurdish rule. If anything, they'll probably be worse.
Hmm.
So, but you just won't hear about it anymore.
Well, if we get our oil, who cares, right?
Yeah, the media just won't cover it anymore.
Right. It's in the interest of the military-industrial complex, which includes, in my view, the oil companies that a lot of the people on the left side of the political spectrum like to rail against. Well, I'm not railing against them only in the sense that they are not free market organisms. They are entities that have been that are basically in bed with the government and get special privileges. Of course, Daniel, I've heard from some of my friends in the Randian group, who tend to be, I think, many of them neocons themselves, that the big mistake we made was not doing in various parts of the world exactly what we did after World War II. We should keep our troops there. We should take control of the governments and permanently run them, more or less, which I think has happened to a great extent. When I talked to one of our guests recently that talks, who's a specialist on Japan, talked about how Japan has been a client state of the United States since World War II, and how we're arming Japan now to counter China as China tries to increase its naval interests so it can protect its own sea lanes. But we don't want China to have protection of its own sea lanes. We want to have control of those sea lanes. That is, the people that run our country. So what do you say to people, though, that think that we should just simply, well, the big mistake was in not insisting on keeping a military presence in Iraq, a permanent military presence, just as we have in Europe? Because people look at Europe and they say, see how well that's worked?
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, people who make that argument are, I think, as you said earlier, it's a fascist argument, a socialist argument in a way, that we should somehow use the military, which is designed to protect the territory of the United States against foreign incursions, to use that military to help socialize the costs of well-connected corporations to do business overseas, so that they can then privatize the profits on the rest of our backs. And if they want to call themselves free market and they're preaching that kind of a policy, then it's a joke,
Yeah, then we can't take them seriously.
No.
Because they're free market as long as it benefits them, but not when it doesn't benefit them.
They're free market when it comes to their profits, but they're socialist when it comes to the costs.
Well, that's certainly what we've seen in the United States with the banking crisis. Privatize profits, socialize losses, and what a good deal if you're on that side of the fence, I suppose, except it's immoral, it's evil, and I think ultimately it's self-destructive for our country as a whole. Well, there's so many great articles at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. I would suggest our listeners go there every day and check out the latest and most important events, because you'll get a different view of what's happening in the world. And also, if you are in sympathy with the quest for truth and a different opinion about what's actually going on, you might find your way to just let loose of 10 or 20 or 30 bucks or more, if you're able, to help out the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, because these guys do an incredible job with very, very little money. Daniel works like a horse. I know, Daniel, which is always, I'm always so honored to have you on here, because I know that you are an honest person who works extremely hard. But before we let you go, there's a couple of other articles I'd like to ask you about. One written by Ron Paul. He says, what have we accomplished in Iraq since we've gone there? Can you talk a little bit about that article? What have we accomplished in 24 years in Iraq, starting with Operations Desert Storm under Bush 1? What have we gotten for our blood and treasury?
Yeah, this is Dr. Paul's column for the week, and it really makes the good point that after 24 years of almost steady bombing of Iraq, we're actually back to square one. We're back to where we were in 1990. There has been absolutely nothing achieved. At least $1 trillion, maybe up to $2 trillion, maybe 1 million deaths have occurred or more. And what about the opportunity cost for our own economy? Yet we're back to the beginning, where we are trying to overthrow a guy in power, putting him in with another guy, trying to start bombing again, thinking that somehow this will bring things right, And as Dr. Paul's conclusion is, after 24 years, maybe it's time to rethink this. Maybe it's time to get out and leave this poor, messed up country alone.
Well, Dr. Paul was saying the same thing a number of years ago when he was running for president the first and second time, and obviously his request that people reconsider and consider pulling out has fallen on deaf ears for the most part. It seems as though policy, even Obama, who supposedly has a gentler foreign policy than Bush, as you just pointed out, didn't come out of Iraq willingly, but in fact was because Maliki wouldn't go along with the request for us to stay there. So I don't know. It doesn't seem as though anybody's really learning to know too much, or learning very much from the past. I mean, the same thing we see in economics. We continue with the same policies of printing money, and it just keeps digging us into deeper, creating bubbles and malinvestment and bigger problems. Speaking of Iraq, one of the things that I've always believed, and in fact, thinking back on during the time of the Vietnam War, one senator from the South, whose name escapes me at the moment, made the case that, in fact, if we continue doing what we're doing in Vietnam, we will corrupt ourselves internally. That is, that the very things that we are supposed to stand for as a nation, we are clearly not standing for overseas, and if we continue to do that, sooner or later it's going to have a negative impact on our quality of life, on our liberties and our freedoms. And now another article that Dr. Paul wrote, Mission Creep in Iraq and Missouri. And this has to do, I guess, with the idea of something you and I have talked about on this show before. You've talked about these huge and powerful weapons that are made for war have now been given over to local governments. Talk to us a little bit about Ron Paul's article on mission creep in Iraq and Missouri.
Yeah, it's, Dr. Paul makes a great point. It was an interview that he gave with Andre Mitchell on MSNBC the other day that we posted, where he points out that, you militarize the police, you give them military weapons, you give them tanks and illegal gases, and it creates a culture, and it encourages them to overreact, the kinds of overreaction that we're seeing in Missouri this past few days. And, he makes a great point that police are supposed to be local people. They're supposed to be police officers or peace officers, not warriors.
Right. They're supposed to be our friends. The cop on the beat, the picture I see from Norman Rockwell that has a policeman bending over and giving the little boy in the neighborhood a piece of candy, that sort of thing. Cops were supposed to be here as our friends, not as our adversaries, right?
And once again, it's because of the warfare state. There was a legislation that passed in the late 1990s that was reinvigorated after 2001. That transferred military equipment, so-called surplus military equipment, from the military to local police forces. So you have these small police forces, including, in my new little town of Lake Jackson with a couple thousand people. They've got a tank. I mean, it's ridiculous. So you give these police officers tanks and riot gear, and as Dr. Paul points out, dangerous gases that would be against international law if they were used in wartime. You give them to cops, and they're going to want to use these goodies on people. So it's really a very toxic and poisonous environment, and it's not just about this town in Missouri. This is something that's been happening over the last few years. We all remember what happened in the Boston bombing, how they just basically, it was like the military took over this town.
For sure.
Very frightening. It's very frightening.
Yeah, busting down doors without warrants or anything, just going into homes. It really was frightening. I agree with you. I guess most people say, well, I haven't done anything wrong. Well, I don't have anything to worry about. Well, what about those people that had their doors busted down? They didn't do anything wrong either. So,
and even in Missouri, and it's a complicated situation. However, you do have folks that were on their own front yards, their own private property, standing around talking, and the police were firing tear gas at them. So they're not even defending private property, First Amendment rights. It's something that's very dangerous, and if people who've done something wrong and who haven't done something wrong should pay attention because they'll be next.
Yeah, you can imagine. This show deals mostly with financial issues, but you can imagine if things really melt down. Let's say the 2008-2009 thing had continued to implode, and the cash machines weren't available, and food wasn't getting on shelves, and general anarchy would break loose. You could see the totalitarian capabilities of a police force armed with military gear. One of the things that Dr. Paul talked about was blowback, and blowback certainly is something I think we're seeing. I don't think the media talks about it at all. They don't want us to see it. But, one of the things that really strikes me is that we seem to, our friends today, we talked about this a little bit ago in terms of individual dictators and puppets that we put into power. They're our friends today, but in the future they're no longer our friends. And it seems to me, Daniel, one of the things that is so striking is this notion, or this reality, in fact, that we arm certain groups, or arms get into these countries, and then they're used by our adversaries. And there was an article, the Ron Paul Institute, titled "The Terrorists Fighting Us Now. We Just Finished Training Them." Can you talk to us? Give us an example. This was written by somebody named McAdams.
Yeah. This was a fair use excerpt that we put up, and I thought it was fascinating because it talks about how the U.S. armed these rebel groups in Libya to overthrow the Gaddafi regime. They started in Benghazi. They were armed and trained by the U.S. government, and from there they moved over to Syria to help the U.S. overthrow the Assad government in Syria. These were radicalized groups. These were radical Islamic groups. And then from Syria, many of them joined the al-Nusra Front. Others, and most of them now joined the IS or ISIS. Mm-hmm. And now they're in Iraq using weapons that they stole from the United States to attack the government of Iraq, which is backed by the United States. And the U.S. is in a strange situation of bombing its own weapons that were stolen by people that had been supported and trained by them. So the article is more mild than I would say, but it's basically it criticizes the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, because these things have backfired. Yeah. As you point out, the risk of blowback is great, and mm-hmm. Unless this is some grand scheme cooked up by some world changers somewhere, and they really want this chaos, mm-hmm. unless that's the case, it looks like their plans have gone terribly, terribly bad.
Yeah, I sure hope what you say isn't true. Speculate that that's what's going on, because if there's a grand scheme for a one-world government, which some people seem to think it could very well be the case, then it is a very frightening situation what we have going on, because then there is a method to the madness. There is a reason to want to have more chaos and bloodshed and destruction. So you destroy everything in your sight so that nobody has any power or freedom, and then you just run the whole place. I guess that's the theory. It sure seems to me the direction of things, Daniel, that our policymakers want is to take away the sovereignty of nations. I mean, to me, that's what the Ukraine is all about. It's about the United States wanting to take away the sovereignty of certainly the influence of Vladimir Putin. Just as we don't want the Chinese to have the right to protect their own sea lanes, it seems to me that our military-industrial complex wants to have as much power globally as possible. Do you not agree? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't know what to think. I don't know what to think of that. I think you may well be right, but you certainly see chaos all over the place, and the same neocons who cause the problem are the ones on TV who they give the opportunity to try to fix it.
It seems to me, Daniel, that unless we get back to the truth about various things in our history, and Lord knows there's been, I think, a lot written about World War I, World War II, that clearly shows that the propaganda that we were given during those periods of time to get us into those wars was exactly that, propaganda, not necessarily truthful propaganda. So, we go back to the most recent, really traumatic issue in the United States, and that was 9/11. And on your site, Congressman Walter Jones, who's worked very closely with Ron Paul on foreign affairs issues in the past, he and Ron Paul talked about the Saudi Arabia Bush administration 9/11 cover-up. Before we conclude our discussion today, could you possibly give our listeners a little bit of a background on that? And then I would like to just say, folks, that you can go and read these things and get all the details that are there. Daniel has just a short period of time to share them with us, but I would very much encourage you to go to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. You can read this article that has to do with the Bush administration 9/11 cover-up, but could you possibly just summarize it for our listeners, Daniel?
Sure. This is Congressman Walter Jones from North Carolina, who's long been a friend of Dr. Paul's, and he was interviewed on Dr. Paul's TV show this week, The Voices of Liberty, and Walter Jones is one of the few people, and it's been only congresspersons, who've seen this classified 28 pages from the 9/11 report. Thus far, none of us have been able to see it. And he was so shocked by what he saw that he even introduced a resolution in Congress demanding that these be declassified so that Americans can see what was in this report. And interestingly, even the original authors of the report, the heads of the 9/11 Commission, have suggested that that these pages be declassified. And although Walter Jones is not able to talk at all about what he saw because it's classified, he said American people have the right to know the truth. He said him and other members have said this will be shocking when people see what was in these pages. Apparently it deals with who was financing the attacks on 9/11. Mm-hmm. I think we can speculate about the complicity of the Saudi Arabian government just from what little we can piece together on it. And it's in everyone's interest. This is a chilling quote from Representative Jones. He said, "There will be no hope for America's future if the American people do not know the truth about a tragedy such as 9/11." Pretty strong words.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And, I guess maybe Americans don't know. They don't have enough knowledge about what our country is to alarm them to the fact that things are changing. One of the things that you and I have talked about, the people that seem to be most adamant and most pro-American in terms of sending military forces into the Ukraine tend to be people from Eastern Europe. And my contention with those folks is that they are thinking in terms of the America that once was, what we stand for in the Constitution. What they don't see, in my view, is the degradation of our country from within, and that the America that they think of as being the savior of the world and making people free and giving them liberty or freeing them up to be free, that is, reducing government, the policies of our founding fathers that did serve us very well to a great extent for so many years, they still think that is America. But I think they don't understand that this is no longer America and that you don't gain your freedom by force through military action. But yeah, I think it's just, to know what the truth is, absolutely, that the truth will set you free. That's what the good book says. I believe it's very, very, very true, that unless you know what really happened on 9/11, if there's a major cover-up and there's other sinister forces behind the scene, perhaps even wanting to have that occur in the United States, certainly it hasn't hurt the military-industrial complex, has it?
No, not at all. They've profited enormously from it.
Yeah, so some people, it always, I think, makes some sense to see where they where follow the money, I guess is what some people say, and that certainly would be interesting. We know, I believe that it was right a day or two before 9/11, there were huge short positions taken out on airliners and I think on some insurance companies as well. So there were reports of that immediately after 9/11. So could be very interesting. If you knew something was coming like that, yeah. You could do very well in shorting American Airlines or something like that and making a huge profit from it. So I don't know.
They want to demonize everyone as truthers and this and that, but the reality is, Dr. Paul, I know for sure, and I know Walter Jones, they don't speculate on what happened. They don't want to blame Martians or anything else. They don't trust what the government said, and they want to find out what the government knows about it. So it's not some great sinister truther thing. It's just simply being skeptical of what the government is feeding them.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you again, Daniel, for sharing your time with us and helping us to see the light, as it were, about what's really going on in the world. And again, folks, please go to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity read Daniel's articles, the articles by many contributors there. Ron Paul, first and foremost, I guess, in many ways, so many things there that I think will really help you to understand what's going on, and talk to your friends about it. I mean, I think change occurs from the bottom up, and you can all be a better citizen, be a better American if you know what the truth is, and if for no other reason than just to examine what you're being told by the propaganda machine that we're all just given what is supposed to be the truth, and we're not supposed to ask any questions. Well, as long as we are allowed to still ask questions, as long as Daniel McAdams and the Ron Paul Institute for Peace is allowed to continue talking, I hope and pray that they will continue doing so, and I hope and pray that all of you that listen to this show will do your small part to help your family understand what's going on. And in regard to that also, scratch together $5, $10, $15, $20, $25, $30 or so, or whatever you're able, and your heart leads you to let loose from your pocketbook. Send it to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, because the Daniel and others that are working with them are doing a great job, I think, in helping us understand what's really going on. Thanks again, Daniel, for being with me, and I look forward to doing it again next week.
Thank you so much, Jay.